South Carolina. The fields stretched wide, heavy with cotton and shadow. So fell, and at the center of it all stood the old plantation house. Its columns gleamed pale in the moonlight, but its walls held a silence, thicker than the humid night air. People whispered of strange things behind those shutters, of a family marked not by blessing, but by a curse too heavy to name aloud. The master of that house was Elias Thornwell, a man of rigid command, whose word was as final as scripture and whose silence was more frightening than anger. He had 2 daughters, Annabeth and Clara, pale, watchful women rarely seen beyond the gates of their father's land. When they did appear at the Sunday service, their heads were bowed, their hands clutched tightly at their shawls, and their eyes, those restless gray eyes, never dared to meet another's. No suitors ever called on them. No proposals were whispered. Yet, year by year, more children filled the pews of the small plantation chapel. They bore the Thornwell eyes, the Thornwell jaw. But when asked of their fathers, the lines in the ledger remained empty. They were siblings under one roof, yet cousins on the page. Neil, a teacher at the parish schoolhouse, first marked the confusion, names repeated where they should not. Ages too close together, too tangled. The daughters of Elias brought forth children, but no husband's name followed. The town women spoke in whispers as they shelled peas or washed linens by the creek. A shame, such pretty girls, and then lower their voices sinking. But whose children are those? Kyle, a midwife, once spoke too much after a long night's work at the Thornwell house. She muttered of a man's boots by the bedside, of coins pressed too tightly into her hand, of screams muffled beneath hymns hummed through clenched teeth. By morning she was gone, moved westward, her name scratched out of the local records. Inside the plantation walls, Elias Thornwell reigned as king. He allowed no suitors, no marriages, no alliances beyond the blood that already bound the house. His daughters were not daughters but vessels, his word not guidance but law. And the children, dozens of them, pale-faced, silent, all carrying the same shadow in their eyes, were raised not to question, but to obey. The silence of the county was a silence of survival. Men at the store would lower their voices when the Thornwell name was spoken. Women in the pews would glance at one another when another infant appeared at the chapel. But no one dared to break the seal. What happened in the plantation house was the master's affair. That was the way of the South, yet, like a crack spreading through glass, truth resists burial. A preacher, one autumn Sunday, lingered too long on the scripture in Leviticus, his voice trembling as he spoke of forbidden unions, of sins that poison generations. His gaze swept the congregation and landed on the Thornwell pew, where Annabeth sat with 3 children pressed close to her skirts. Clara was beside her, holding an infant swaddled in white. Elias sat behind them, his face unreadable, his hand resting heavy on the back of the bench. No words were spoken then, but the air shifted. A weight pressed down on every chest. The whispers began again that night, heavier than before, circling like smoke that cannot be contained. In the Thornwell house, candles burned late. Diaries hidden beneath loose floorboards bore trembling words written by Clara's hand, of nights she could not forget, of doors that did not lock, of a father's shadow filling her room like a sentence she could never escape. The ink smeared where her tears had fallen. But the truth remained. Neighbors would say years later that they always knew something was wrong. They saw the way the children avoided touch, the way their eyes dropped. When asked simple questions, the way their features mirrored one another too closely. They said they suspected, but suspicion is not the same as courage. I know, and so the house remained silent. The fields heavy with cotton, and the Thornwell name passed from ledger to ledger, tied to children who carried both the innocence of birth and the weight of sin. This was South Carolina, 1845. A time when a father's power was a fortress, when silence was safety, and when a family's darkest truth could grow for generations beneath the polished face of a plantation house. But truth does not vanish. It waits. It marks the blood, the bone, the whispered record of the children left behind. And even as the shutters stayed closed and the doors locked tight, the valley carried the echo of a question too dangerous to speak aloud. What becomes of a world where daughters bear the children of their own father? Please share your location and time in the comments. These stories carry further than the walls that once tried to contain them. And if keeping these truths alive matters to you, subscribe, so their silence is never complete again. The winter of 1845 pressed itself hard against Burke County, and though the cotton was long harvested, the Thornwell plantation did not rest. Smoke poured from its chimneys, lantern light glowed in the upper windows, well into the night, and the air around the house seemed heavy, like a place that carried too much breath inside and not enough release. The townsfolk whispered as they passed, but their eyes always looked away. At the parish schoolhouse, the young teacher, Miss Eleanor Briggs, sat bent over her ledger one December evening. She was a quiet woman, barely 22, who had been raised by her aunt. After fever took her family, her reputation was modest, her faith steady, but she possessed a sharpness of mind that saw patterns where others ignored them. And it was those patterns that troubled her most. The Thornwell children filled more than one page of her register. Names repeated, ages overlapped, and the spaces meant for fathers remained empty. Year after year. The children sat in her classroom with stillness that unsettled her. They never laughed as children should. They never played with the others at recess. Their eyes were watchful, always flicking back toward the door, as if waiting for something, or someone, to enter. One evening, Eleanor stayed long after the other children had gone, studying the entries in silence. Samuel, Clara's boy, born in 1837. Ruth, Annabeth's girl, born in 1838. Then Thomas, another of Clara's, born scarcely a year later. It went on like this, year after year, alternating between the sisters, but always under the same roof. Always marked with the Thornwell surname, and no other. She dipped her pen and wrote a single note in the margin, the father's missing. Cly. Why? The question lingered like smoke in her mind, and soon it became more than just ink on paper. It became a weight she carried with her every Sunday, every market day, every time her path crossed with the Thornwell family. The girls, Annabeth and Clara, were rarely seen outside the plantation gates, and when they did come to town, it was always with Elias Thornwell himself. He walked between them, tall and severe, his cane striking the ground with each step, his daughters trailing like shadows. They never spoke, their lips pressed thin, their eyes lowered. Townsfolk would nod politely, then step aside. The silence around that family was not respect, it was fear. It was one night in late January when Eleanor's suspicions hardened into something more dangerous. She had stayed at the schoolhouse late again, the fire low, her pen scratching across the ledger, when she heard a sound outside. A child's sob. She rose quickly, opening the door into the cold night air. There, standing by the edge of the wood, was a girl no older than 7. Barefoot, shivering, her nightdress torn at the hem. It was one of the Thornwell children, Ruth. Ill. Eleanor pulled her inside, wrapping her in a shawl, kneeling before her with a candle casting shadows across the walls. But Ruth would not speak. She only stared with wide, frightened eyes, her small body trembling. Eleanor asked her what had happened, why she was out so late, but the child shook her head violently, as if even the thought of answering might summon something worse. And then, just as quickly, there came a voice from the trees. Low, commanding, unmistakable, Ruth. The girl flinched, her face draining of what little color remained. Elias Thornwell stepped into the clearing, lantern in hand, his eyes narrowing as they fell on Eleanor. He was not a man easily shaken, but his presence in that doorway carried a weight that pressed the air flat. He did not shout, did not curse. He simply extended his hand. "Come here, child." Ruth obeyed, slipping from Eleanor's grasp without a word. Elias looked once at Eleanor, long enough to let the silence speak for him, then turned and walked back into the night, the girl trailing behind. No explanation, no farewell, only silence. The next morning, Ruth did not come to school, nor the next day, nor the one after. Eleanor's questions to the family were met with nothing but polite nods and a single phrase: "She is unwell." Yet no doctor was ever called, and when Eleanor rode past the plantation weeks later, she saw Ruth by an upstairs window, her face pressed to the glass, her hand lifted weakly in what might have been a wave or a plea. The whispers in town thickened. At the general store, women spoke in lowered voices about how the Thornwell sisters never married, how their father kept them locked away, how children kept appearing as if by some grim clockwork. Men at the tavern muttered over whiskey about strange business at that house, though none dared to name it outright. One or two spoke of bloodlines, of sins too deep to cleanse. But when asked directly, they fell silent, their eyes dropping to their glasses in the silence of the night. When the mountains lay wrapped in their eternal stillness, a darker truth began to unfold within the old house of Hollow Creek. The bond that should have been innocent between the sisters was instead smothered by fear, pressure, and a hidden sin that clung to every breath they took. Villagers had begun to whisper more openly now. Why do the girls' eyes look so empty? Why do they never speak freely? An old pastor often muttered, convinced that they carried a burden too heavy to ever name. The father's grip was merciless, his twisted law binding the sisters into a prison of flesh and shame. At night, under the suffocating darkness, he demanded obedience. His voice was sharp, his presence unrelenting. Any sign of resistance was met with starvation, with whips, with torment that crushed not only the body, but the spirit itself. And if one dared to rebel, punishment would rain down upon them all, silencing every tongue in the house. New years passed under this shadow. The most horrifying truth emerged when the sisters began to bear children, one by one. These births did not bring joy or laughter. Instead, they carried an unspoken terror. Some of the children bore uncanny resemblances, their faces carrying marks of a bloodline too closely tied. The villagers did not speak of it aloud, yet their silence screamed the truth. Some of the children were frail, others born with minds clouded, some never surviving more than a few weeks. And those who lived carried faces marked with questions no one dared to answer. The mother, who should have been a shield to her daughters, turned away. She chose silence, the same silence that had kept her alive all these years. Her eyes would look elsewhere, as if pretending nothing had happened. She knew too well that to resist meant to invite the same torment. Her daughters endured. The house itself seemed cursed, a place where the walls wept and the floors echoed with unending sorrow. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a cry. The sisters looked at one another, and in their eyes lay questions, but none ever dared to give voice to them. Time passed, and the villagers began to keep their distance. No one approached the house anymore. Children, if forced to pass by, would shiver and run. Adults whispered in their gatherings, their voices low, their eyes fearful, never daring to mention the family by name. This was around the year Itzen Bad by Jules Sursus. Yet even now, one question lingers in the air like smoke that refuses to vanish. How long could the sisters endure such a burden? Did they ever speak the truth aloud? Or were their secrets buried forever within the rotting beams and crumbling walls of Hollow Creek. The winter of 1846 settled heavy upon South Carolina. Frost clung to the fields, and the skies hung gray over the plantation house where the sisters lived in silence. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating, carrying with it the smell of smoke, damp wood, and something far darker, the scent of secrets too heavy to remain buried. One evening, Reverend Thomas Granger, a man known for his stern sermons and sharper eyes, stood before his congregation. His voice was steady, drawn from the book of Leviticus. Yet, his words carried a weight that made the townsfolk shift uncomfortably in their pews. He spoke of forbidden blood, of fathers who sinned against their own daughters, of sins that cursed not only the family, but the land itself. Though no names were uttered, everyone felt the shadow that loomed over the plantation. Eyes dropped, hands tightened on worn Bibles, and silence once again became the shield of the guilty. But whispers are like smoke. They find cracks, seeping through even the thickest walls. A midwife named Clara, who had once delivered the children of the sisters, carried her own unease. She had seen too much. Births where the lineage could not be explained. Children whose features reflected truths no one dared to speak. She was paid to stay silent, coins pressed into her hand, her eyes turned away. Yet guilt gnawed at her, each coin a weight upon her soul. No, the sisters themselves had grown pale shadows of the girls they once were. Erty wore, their eyes rarely lifted, their voices reduced to murmurs. Louisa, the eldest, carried the deepest scars. At night, she would sit by the cracked window, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, whispering prayers that never seemed to reach heaven. Her younger sister, Mary, carried fresh bruises, her silence more haunting than any scream. Children played in the fields by day, but even their laughter sounded hollow. Villagers who saw them spoke in hushed tones afterward. The children bore resemblances too strong, their faces a cruel mirror of the man who ruled the plantation. They were siblings, cousins, and something far worse all at once. It was Clara, the midwife, who first began to write things down. She hid her notes in a wooden box beneath loose floorboards of her cabin. Names, dates, births, all carefully recorded. A secret ledger of sin. She feared discovery. But more than that, she feared what would happen if no one ever spoke the truth. The plantation, once alive with the noise of labor and the bustle of workers, had grown eerily quiet. Visitors avoided it. Neighbors spoke of strange cries at night, of candles burning in windows, long past midnight, of shadows moving even when no one was there. Some whispered that the land itself had become cursed, the soil poisoned by the sins it bore. And yet, inside that house, life continued as if trapped in an endless cycle. The father's word remained law, his silence heavier than chains. The sisters obeyed, their bodies broken but their spirits clinging to a faint, flickering hope that one day someone would come, someone would name the truth aloud. But until then, the house remained what it had always been, a prison of blood and sin, a place where the walls themselves seemed to breathe, carrying secrets that no winter frost could ever freeze away. By the spring of 1847, the silence that had guarded the plantation for years began to fracture. Clara's hidden ledger, the record of births, of names, of the children whose bloodlines were twisted beyond nature, did not remain buried. A curious neighbor, searching for firewood in Clara's cabin after she fell ill, stumbled upon the loose floorboard. Beneath it lay the truth. The pages, yellowed and smudged with ink, told a story no one wished to read. Each entry carried the weight of sin. Daughters giving birth under the same roof as the father who ruled them. Children marked by both innocence and shame. Word spread like fire through dry grass. First in whispers, then in hushed conversations at the general store, and finally in full voices that trembled with outrage. Reverend Granger, upon reading Clara's record, stood in his pulpit with a fury unlike any the town had heard before. His booming voice filled the church, naming the sin without hesitation. No longer cloaked in metaphor, he declared, "A man who makes his daughters mothers is no father at all. He is a beast in human form." That night, a group of men gathered, lanterns in hand, their faces pale but resolute. Fear had long held them silent, but the weight of knowing had grown unbearable. The plantation house loomed ahead, its windows dark, its walls heavy with secrets. The air was still as though the land itself held its breath. They entered with force. Doors were broken, shutters torn aside. What they found was worse than rumor. Rooms filled with children who bore the same pale eyes, the same sharp jaw, echoes of one man's face repeated again and again. The sisters sat in silence, clutching the little ones, their expressions empty, as though their souls had been drained long ago. Cole, the father, was dragged from his room, half drunk, roaring curses that echoed through the night. He was a man who had once been feared, but in that moment he looked small, pitiful, a tyrant stripped of his power. His reign ended not with dignity, but with the rope that swung from an old oak tree at the edge of the field. But even after his body hung limp, the curse did not vanish. The land remained heavy, the house a scar on the earth. The sisters, though freed, carried wounds too deep to ever heal. Some of the children grew into adulthood, their eyes forever bearing the mark of their origin. They were whispers of shame in every corner of town, living reminders of a sin no one could forget. Clara's ledger, smuggled away by the Reverend, became the only testimony that survived. Years later, it would be spoken of in fragments, in dark corners, in voices lowered, as if the dead might rise to silence them. And so the story of the plantation was never written in the town's proud history books. It lived instead in shadows, passed down in secret, an account of how silence can shelter monsters, how a father can twist the holy bond of family into something unspeakable, and how a community's fear can feed the darkness until it swallows them whole. Even now, when the wind passes through the broken windows of the abandoned house, some say it carries voices, low, mournful, and eternal. The voices of daughters who were never truly free.